It's not me, it's you. Dear Met, I loved you for more than 30 years. I came to this country as a young man with very little money and not much certainty about where, exactly, I belonged. The Met opened its doors to me for a nominal fee. That mattered, more than I probably understood at the time. I had grown up in Moscow, where I spent days and days in the Pushkin Museum and the Tretyakovka. Those were not just museums to me. They were shelters, places where one could stand in front of a painting and, for a while, step outside the late-period Soviet mixture of concrete, boredom, ideology, more concrete, and bad lighting. When I found the Met, I felt that I had found the American version of that refuge, a new home. Later, when I worked on a minor in art history, I spent hours walking through the Met, more hours watching my classmates sketch masterpieces. There is something deeply moving about watching young people sit silently before a painting, trying to understand with their hands what their minds cannot yet say. Over the years, I brought friends to the Met, dates too. My wife and I have gone 3 or 4 times a year for as long as I can remember. When our son turned 7, we started bringing him on walks through the galleries. This is where he learned that paintings speak to him. That is not a small thing, but this is not a love letter. This is a Dear John letter. I noticed the change before I fully understood it. The first crack came after COVID. In November 2020, when the Met reopened, I came back expecting reunion. I did not expect innocence. I am not an idiot, despite years of formal education trying its best. Museums are never neutral. Art has always been entangled with power, wealth, conquest, faith, sex, death, patronage, vanity, genius, theft, and the rest of the sins and virtues that make us human. But when I entered the Great Hall, I saw 2 enormous paintings dominating the entrance. They were not merely displayed in the museum. They greeted you. They stood at the threshold as if the Met itself had decided that before one entered the House of Art, one had to pass through indictment. The paintings were Kent Monkman's Mistykosiwak, Wooden Boat People, a diptych consisting of welcoming the newcomers and resurgence of the people. They were not works the Met had simply acquired and chosen to display. They were commissioned by the Met itself. That matters. A museum can display an argument without making the argument its own. It can show Goya without becoming Goya. It can show David without endorsing Napoleon. It can show Christian altarpieces without requiring conversion at the door. But when a museum commissions a work, places it in the Great Hall, and makes it the first thing a visitor encounters, the distinction collapses. This was not merely an artist speaking inside the museum. This was the museum deciding what its first words should be. Again, my objection was not to Monkman. To be honest, I did not much like the paintings. To my eye, they had ambition, but not depth, theatricality, but not subtlety, technical confidence, but not elegance, and most of all, a clear agitprop purpose. But that is my taste, and my taste is not museum policy. There is plenty of art in the Met that leaves me cold, plenty I dislike, and some I find actively objectionable. All of it belongs there. I do not want any of it removed. That is the point. A great museum is not a mirror held up to my preferences. It is a house large enough for objects I love, objects I resist, objects I do not understand, and objects that make arguments I reject. I am happy to share the museum with people who do not share my aesthetics or my politics. The Met's job is not to protect me from Monkman or Monkman from me. It is to preserve the room in which the encounter can happen without the institution placing its thumb on the scale. Artists are allowed to argue, accuse, invert, mock, revise, and wound. Viewers are allowed to look, disagree, walk to a different room, or come back tomorrow. That is part of the job description, insofar as artists have ever tolerated job descriptions. What unsettled me was not that the paintings existed. What unsettled me was that the Met had made them the threshold. The Met had become one of the voices. Worse, it had become the official voice, and I recognized the cadence. I know what propaganda sounds like when it has been written by committee and inserted into everything as an interpretive key. I spent the first 19 years of my life listening to it. In that world, nothing was allowed simply to exist. A painting was never just a painting. A novel was never just a novel. A statue was never just a statue. Everything arrived with its approved explanation. The artist had revealed class struggle, bourgeois decadence, revolutionary consciousness, historical necessity, or the suffering of the people. The committee always arrived before the viewer. The vocabulary has changed. The suits fit better. The wall text is smoother, but the cadence is familiar. And let me be clear, I would object just as strongly if the framing came from the right. If Raphael were presented as proof of the spiritual superiority of Christian Europe, if Greek sculpture were framed as the natural triumph of the West, if armor were used to preach the spiritual superiority of the Christian warrior, I would find that just as repellent. The problem is not the politics. The problem is compulsory interpretation. A museum may display ideology. It may contextualize ideology. It may stage ideological conflict. What it must not do is occupy the space between the object and the viewer. But over time, that occupation began to spread. The museum's older job was curatorial, the care and display of objects, with the encounter left to the viewer. The newer job is didactic. The objects are still there, but they are arranged for instruction. The labels changed, not all of them. Some still sound like museum labels: artist, workshop, patron, technique, history, influence. A Raphael wall text still speaks that older language. It tells us about Perugino's elegant figures, his command of technique, his efficient methods, Raphael's apprenticeship, patronage, and artistic development. In other words, it helps the viewer understand how an artist became an artist. But elsewhere, another voice has entered the room. A frozen Dutch river is quickly routed through human interventions and environmental changes in the Americas wrought by early European colonialism. A Brazilian landscape is told that it hides the process by which resources were obtained, while the label foregrounds how Dutch colonial Brazil forcibly dispossessed indigenous populations of their land. Bruegel survives longest. His label begins with heat, harvest, shade, bodies resting, triangular forms, and the structure of a season. For a moment, the painting breathes. Then the verdict arrives. The painting is downplaying the difficulty of agricultural labor and responding to the desires of his wealthy urban patron. The wall text gives away the larger shift. The old category, landscape, is no longer enough. The gallery is now framed as ecologies of painting, and the visitor is directed toward class, gender, and colonial power structures. Some of this is true. That is what makes it more irritating. Propaganda is most effective when it contains enough truth to make objection sound like denial. Patronage matters. Empire matters. Wealth, labor, slavery, class, extraction, and violence belong in the conversation. Context matters. But context can illuminate, or it can smother. It can open a painting, or it can place a hand over its mouth. Dear Met, I did not object when you gave me context. I objected when context became cross-examination. I came to you because paintings spoke. Now too often the labels speak first. Before the eye can wander, before the mind can form its own associations, Before the viewer can be surprised, the institution steps in to discipline the encounter. I am not asking the Met to be apolitical. Museums should contain accusation, empire, conquest, the good, the bad, and the ugly. What I am asking is something narrower. I am asking you to trust the viewer. That, I think, is what has actually changed. Not the politics, the trust. Today's visit did not help. Perhaps because of the upcoming Met Gala, or perhaps because of the Raphael exhibit, security seemed doubled or tripled. The guards greeted me with the warmth of TSA agents, crossed with bar bouncers at 4:30 in the morning on St. Patrick's Day. Between the two, I much prefer the latter to the former. Before I reached the art, before I reached even the ticket counter, I had already been reminded that I was no longer entering a home. I was being processed. Then came the ticketing. It appears the automated kiosks are gone, replaced by human tellers who did not want to be there and, more importantly, did not want me there either. The first thing they asked me was where I was from. Brooklyn, I said. This did not satisfy them. They asked for a zip code. I gave it. This too did not satisfy them. Then, for the first time in more than 30 years of going to the Met, I was asked for ID. I have never been asked for ID at the Met. I was not asking for a discount. I have not asked for a discount since I could afford not to. I have paid full price for years and made generous donations. The issue was not the money. The issue was the shift in posture. After 30 years of loving the place, I suddenly felt I had to prove I belonged there at all. And yes, I understand that there are policies. I understand that New York residents may be treated differently from tourists. I understand that institutions need procedures. I am a lawyer. I have inflicted procedures on others. I know the species. But institutions reveal themselves in how they administer their rules. A museum that once opened its doors to me now began by asking where I was from, doubting the answer, and requesting papers. And I know that smell. At the door, you no longer trust me to belong. At the wall, you no longer trust me to look. Somewhere along the way, a beloved institution started talking like a compliance department. So, dear Met, I wish I could say it isn't you, it's me. But I can't. It's you. It is your management. It is your tone. It is the way you now seem to greet visitors with suspicion at the door and instruction on the wall. It is the way you appear increasingly embarrassed by the inheritance you are built to preserve. Not because that inheritance is pure, it never was, but because impurity is not the same as fraud, and context is not the same as confession. You were never innocent. No great museum is. Behind every collection there are patrons, robber barons, colonial officers, dealers, grave robbers, scholars, saints, liars, thieves, and donors trying to purchase immortality by attaching their names to marble. Fine, that is humanity. We have always made beauty out of compromised materials, sometimes out of filth, sometimes out of blood, sometimes out of money, often of all three combined. But I did not love you because you were innocent. I loved you because you were capacious. You had room for contradiction. You had room for Greece and Japan, Egypt and Holland, saints and courtesans, armour and teacups, El Greco's fever and Caravaggio's darkness. You did not need to resolve everything before showing it. You trusted the visitor to stand before the object and wrestle. That trust is what seems to be disappearing. You still have the art. That is why I will come back. I will still walk through the lines of Greek sculpture. I will still visit the Japanese paintings. I will still look for El Greco and Caravaggio. I will still bring my son, because the paintings are still there and they still speak, even when you interrupt them. But something has changed between us. I will still visit you, but I no longer quite come home.